I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Niamh and Professor Fricker. Niamh O'Donnell is the director of the Irish Theatre Institute and has 29 years of professional experience in the arts sector. She has worked with many leading organizations in Ireland, including Mermaid County Wicklow Arts Centre as the director. She's executive producer of the Project Arts Centre, the Gallery of Photography. She's been involved with the Black Church Print Studio, which is an artist resource organization for fine art print. And she's been involved with Arthouse Media Centre. Professor Karen Fricker writes about theatre for the Toronto Star. She's an editorial advisor at Intermission magazine and an adjunct professor of dramatic arts at Brock University. She has a PhD in theatre studies from Samuel Beckett Centre at Trinity College in Dublin, and since 2004 has been co-facilitator of the Young Critics program at Youth Theatre Ireland. She is the co-director of the Circus and its Others Research Project, holding its 4th international conference in Bogotá in February and March of this year. And I'm sure we'll hear something about that this evening. So, celebrating St. Bridget's Day, talking about a time for women in culture and theatre, I am pleased to introduce to you all Niamh O'Donnell and Karen Fricker.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Robert. And hello, everyone. It's so lovely to be in the virtual space of the Canada-Ireland Foundation and to catch up with an old friend. Niamh and I have known each other since, I think, the day I moved to Ireland in 1997, because I moved there in 1997 to start my PhD at Trinity, as you heard I have eventually. And I went to live in a big house for a week or so in Sandymount in Dublin, where a friend of mine was living, and one of his housemates was Niamh O'Donnell. So literally one of the first people I met. And so it's just so great to see you again, Niamh, and to be able to have an opportunity to catch up, even though we've been in touch in the meantime. So as we heard, I want to talk about what the Irish Theatre Institute is and what it does. But first of all, can you kind of give us a little overview of your career? We heard the organizations that you've worked from, and it's really interestingly multidisciplinary or multi-genre in that you've worked in the visual arts and in multimedia as well as in theater. So can you talk us through briefly how you got here?
Okay, hey, thanks, Karen.
Hello.
Yeah, I call myself a cultural omnivore in that I just love all culture and all disciplines. So I started out as an illustrator, but I qualified in college. During the recession, I couldn't get work, so I started volunteering in the Gallery of Photography. And each step I took was kind of almost accidental. I genuinely believe I am where I am now, sort of by accident. But I started in visual art. I as an illustrator, just loved fine art print. Couldn't believe that I was working with 70 artists in a multidisciplinary, or in a big studio, 3 floors. And then, show my age now, the internet was invented and computers and the internet were changing how we were making art. So I moved to this really forward-thinking organization called Arthouse, where I managed the residencies, and I got the opportunity to work with our best visual artists like Grace Weir and Dorothy Cross and James Coleman. And then I was tempted by Project Arts Centre, which I think is where I was when you moved to Ireland. And it's one of the kind of most progressive art centres in the country. It's one of the oldest, and it welcomes all sort of contemporary practice, visual arts, all forms. And I loved it there. I was there for 13 years. It would have been the first time I produced work and toured it nationally and internationally. And then I had a couple of moves. I had a brief stint, too short, in Poetry Ireland, and fell in love with our best poets. And then this job was advertised, and I feel really privileged. I'm here just under 2 years. So yeah, I love it.
Well, thank you so much. And please tell us, what is the Irish Theatre Institute and what is your role there?
Okay, so I am the director. We are an institute, but there are 4.5 of us. So it makes us sound very grandiose. But we're ultimately an all-island resource organisation for theatre. So we support theatre artists and theatre makers by giving them support in relation to professional development, capacity building, as well as building kind of content. We offer residencies and bursaries, and then we platform work at home and abroad. I mean, my kind of the remit, like if I were to give you my spiel when I'm talking to the Arts Council, is like we're working to keep theatre alive and thriving, you know, as relevant and exciting today as it always has been.
Amazing, thank you. And we're going to get into these issues of kind of where is culture in Ireland right now? Like, how is that going in keeping theatre vibrant? But as we were thinking about how to, you know, there's so many things that we could talk about, and we thought that on this Bridget's Day, we would focus on some recent issues in Irish culture and Irish theatre that specifically have to do with women and with gender and with rights issues. And so we want to talk about the effects of the Me Too movement on the Irish art scene. And there's an important story to tell there about a movement that happened called Waking the Feminists, hashtag Waking the Feminists, and which ended up being a national and international talking point around the place of women's voices in the present and historically, and women's work in Irish theatre. So Niamh, can you talk about Waking the Feminists? When was it? What was it? And then how were you involved in that and some related movements and actions?
Okay. So Karen, if I go on too long, will you just interrupt me?
Yes. Okay.
And again, okay. So
yeah.
Waking the Feminists was in late 2015. And how it started was the National Theatre, so the Abbey Theatre, was announcing, kind of launching its commemorative programme for the centenary of the 1916 Rising, which, as most people know, it was the rebellion that led to Irish independence. And their programme was called Waking the Nation. And in the Irish context, waking has that kind of double meaning, you know, so, you know, to wake, obviously, but also to like to be awake, but also to wake. So kind of that kind of mourning and the deceased and gathering together to mourn. And so the launch was in, I think it was October 2015. And they gathered a whole load of us from the sector. And this amazing artist called Leon Bell looked at the programme, and on our way home, totted up the male and female ratio in the Waking the Nation programme. And she just tweeted basically saying, is this really good enough? I only see one female playwright and I can't even add the female creatives represented in the programme. And she just said how disappointed she was. And there was a little flurry of response where other artists like, I think, Belinda McKeown and Gavin Costick started commenting, going, yes, this doesn't seem right. And what happened was the Abbey's director, Viv McO'Neill, made the kind of misguided decision to answer the questions on Twitter, sort of off the cuff. And I think he actually said at one point, them's the breaks. And it just caused this whole sea of commentary and upset and it just wouldn't go away. It just wouldn't stop. And the kind of the power of the personal testimonies of artists and arts workers talking about kind of being disadvantaged, being overlooked, and not being included was incredibly powerful. And it just caused a huge sort of furore to the point where the Abbey had to try to make changes. So that was October. And then there was something like 12 different Waking the Feminist events around the country on Nullag na Món, which is the 6th of January. And then there was this massive sectoral event, I think, on International Women's Day in Liberty Hall. And then there was something for for Midsummer in June. So it just was this rolling, it lasted 3 or 4 years and it completely transformed the sector.
So it's amazing to remember that time, because I was living here at that time. And to me, it was just an extraordinary example of action, and that came out of programming and then social media. And then it was like rolling, and it rolled. But that also reflects incredible organization and work and labor and care from the group of people who decided that they weren't going to let this one rest. So can you talk about what did change come from it? Like, what happened?
Yeah, it definitely did. And I do think it has to be acknowledged that core group of women and men who met once a week, every week for 2.5 years, insisting that it wasn't dropped, that it wasn't let go, engaging with huge, like with the kind of key cultural organizations, doing gender counts in all of their program and asking them to explain, really, and then banging down the door of kind of the key stakeholders like the Arts Council and the Department of Arts, saying, well, you're funding them, why are you letting discrimination happen? And so it was carrot stick, I think. But it really did fundamentally change. And what was interesting is it didn't just stay within theatre. I think the Irish Film Board were the first kind of organization outside of theatre to come on board and to publish their stats. And it has now, like gender, in relation to any funding body, it's, gender balance. Now, I'm not saying we are completely perfect, because we're not, but we are streets ahead of where we were, like streets ahead, and people are still being called out. So it's good.
Yeah. And I mean, I observe, again, I come back to Ireland multiple times a year to work on the Young Critics program. I'm not nearly in the heart of it as I was, or as you are still, Niamh, but it seems to me that there is an increased visibility of female leadership at Irish theatre organizations. For example, the Abbey's now co-run by a woman and a man. Our last two artistic directors at the Gate have been women. So, I mean, that's my anecdotal take, but do we see it reflected in leadership as well as programming?
Yes, definitely. I do think that there's been a culture shift. I think partly the international profile that Waking the Feminist achieved. I think Waking the Feminist got the Lily Award in New York. There was I'm not going to remember all of the names, but there was a huge response. I know that obviously Irish actors like Saoirse Ronan, Simone Kirby and Denise Gough and Alwyn Ferrore, but then also Emmy Award winning actresses. We had Meryl Streep was online going, go, you go. And so it just seemed that to get this profile that people just couldn't ignore it anymore. I mean, I would say we still have a lot of work to do in relation to gender balance on boards, even nationally, we're we still have a pay gap, a gender pay gap, et cetera, but it has made a big difference. I would regularly say, yet again, artists are leading the way in relation to social change. And Waking the Feminists has really built.
And did you want to talk about a couple of other related movements that you were particularly engaged in? I'm curious about where were you in all this?
Yeah, so with Waking the Feminists, I was working in Mermaid at the time. It's one of my big regrets that I couldn't make the weekly meetings because I was in Wicklow and I supported from afar. I was not one of the core group. I was lucky enough to speak at one of the latter events. But at that time, so we had the marriage referendum, the equality referendum that was early 2005. And I think as was said in the introduction, Ireland has gone through massive change, kind of massive systemic change, in relation to equality. So the marriage referendum was 2015, Waking the Feminist was 15, 16, 17. And then in 2018, we had Repeal the Eighth. And right in the middle, we had the Me Too movement, so global action. And it hit us really hard, very quickly. An amazingly brave and young theatre maker called Grace Dias posted just a social media post outlining an issue that she'd had with a very senior theatre director in a large theatre house in Dublin, calling him out for inappropriate behaviour post a launch. And again, it was just same as everywhere, this massive calling out of bad behaviour, not necessarily naming people, just naming the behaviour. And that started, again, I'm not sure if you've experienced the same, Karen, but I have this thing of theatre scene, we always seem to be loudest. So the Minister of Arts at the time called 7 key organisations into the Department of Arts and said, what is going on in theatre? And what should we do about it? And so Irish Theatre Institute was nominated by those 7 organisations. We weren't in the room at the time to engage in some research and to start to look at tackling abusive behaviour and dignity work issues in the sector. Have you heard of Safe to Create, Karen?
I had not before you mentioned it, so tell us.
Okay, so the first step was some research, and it was called Speak Up, a Call for Change. And unsurprisingly, the findings were really stark. 51% of people in the sector had experienced bullying. And actually, it's kind of important to say that actually bullying isn't a gender issue. In the research, 42% of the perpetrators of bullying are female. And so, unfortunately, it's the majority male in relation to sexual harassment. But from the research, we started a huge number of events, and we moved from Speak Up to rebranding, calling the campaign or the initiative Safe to Create. And what it is a dignity at work program. And we have a huge website full of resources. The Arts Council, the department, and Screen Ireland now have it, abiding by it or adopting this code of behaviour as a special condition of funding. And we are adamantly looking for meaningful change in relation to harmful behaviour in the sector. So again, it's artist-led. It was a grassroots initiative, and it all came from artists saying enough is enough.
That's amazing. Thank you for telling us about that, because I had not known that was a piece of research and action that you're still involved in. Is that still part of ITI?
Yeah, there was a slight flaw in the methodology of the initial research. So we've just launched a really large piece of research or surveys for looking at the intersectionality between ethnicity, disability, gender identity for artists. And so we'll complete that in March, and we'll launch a new report in June.
Wow, thank you so much. And an interesting sort of segue there. So you are reminding us of the very recent history of Ireland and the incredible change, the cultural change around marriage equity. But very briefly, Niamh, just in case people don't know, could you explain what Repeal the Eighth is? Before we move on? Yeah.
So Repeal the Eighth was in our constitution. There was an equal right to life for a woman and child. So Repeal the Eighth was a campaign to change that amendment in our constitution. It was ongoing for years in relation to women's rights, and finally a momentum grew behind it. And I think it was May 2018. We finally went to a referendum, and I think it was about 66% of the population voted in favour of repealing the Eighth. So the constitution was changed in order to, before that, I mean, we have a shameful history around certain rights and people's rights, or women's rights, travellers' rights in this country. But actually, because we had cases where the courts were stepping in to stop young people travelling with unwanted pregnancies as a result of, assault. But thankfully, 66% of the population voted positively. And yes, so now the termination of pregnancy is in our legislation.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding us of that. So to think back to the time of incredible change that was happening in Ireland, when I moved there, I was in my teensy way part of that change, in that I was an inward emigrant to Ireland, drawn there by the lure of the Samuel Beckett Centre and studying in the excellent theatre studies program there, but also because, to put it bluntly and not in a very sophisticated way, Ireland was really cool. And this was the period that we were then calling and still call the Celtic Tiger. And it was a time of incredible change when a country that had been a source of outward migration for its history, all of a sudden that reversed, and people were moving there to benefit from so many things that can come from living in Ireland. And that meant, amongst other things, diversification in terms of who lives in Ireland, who calls himself Irish. And I think a lot of things changed about who lives in Ireland and who Irish people are. So could you talk about how how is that sitting now 2+, 3+ decades on, 2+, in terms of how Ireland has transformed as a multicultural place? And how is that manifest in particular in the world of theater? Huge question, sorry. Over to you.
Okay, so just really briefly, I think the Celtic Tiger is really important in this because it just triggered everything. So for like, what was it? For more than 2 centuries, we were the poorest country in Europe. And then suddenly we had the Celtic Tiger, so we were boom years, 95 to 2007, where I think our GDP grew by, well, from the 80s to 2007, grew by 229%. So it was just this massive time where everybody was swanning around and completely lost the run of themselves. And we were on every economic magazine across, like, internationally. It was, we felt really, because in Ireland, even though I know in Canada and the States, we have like this amazing diaspora. But like, as an Irish person on the island, you regularly feel a little bit like you're on the very edge of Europe. You're on the periphery. Are we culturally relevant? There's lots of questions that we ask ourselves. And so the Celtic Tiger just kind of seemed to stamp us on the map. And then we had the global economic crisis, which I refer to as a crisis of value, because we had lost ourselves in what value was. But during the Celtic Tiger, we had a huge influx of people from everywhere. And it was remarkable. Like, we were only accustomed to, as you've said, Karen, to people leaving. Like, when the crisis hit, 36,000 young Irish people emigrated in 2008. So I'm sorry, we're only a small country, and Canada, I always look going, we're so small. Where, I think the census, our 2022 census, we have for the first time gone over 5 million people. So the last time we were over 5 million people, I'm just going to pull up the figure because I looked it up yesterday. So since 1891, so after the famine and mass emigration, we dropped below 5 million, and 2022, so 131 years later, we are back up over. And an amazing part of that is that 700,000 people are non-Irish. So like new Irish is what is the new language that we use here. So our new Irish colleagues, comrades and friends and family. So in theatre, we've been very slow diversifying, and I'm ashamed of it. In other art forms, like, one of the things that I experienced in poetry was the poetry was so much quicker, because spoken word was so much easier, and you could see the new Irish and how poetry, still a bit male and pale and stale, but it's more diverse than any other art form. Music also. And then I suppose our key stakeholders, like the Arts Council, have EDI policies. We all have to abide by it. And you can start to see theatre. You can see a change, but it's in the grassroots. So it's where you'd expect to see it, Karen. You'd be able to name them, I'd say, in 2 minutes, like Fringe, Project, all of the kind of edgier spaces. You can actually, that they represent Ireland today, where in our larger institutions, it's a bit slow.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And there's stuff that I could get into about speaking to you about the arts and theater scene in one of the most multicultural cities in the world. But I think I'll jump over that segue just because we're a little bit pressed for time. I will say, just encourage anybody who's listening, if you have questions, please do stick them in the chat, and we'll try to get a couple minutes for questions at the end. So thinking about evolution of culture, and you talked about the shameful history in Ireland of gender rights, and I'm about mother and baby homes and Magdalene laundries, and that's something, I think that's a reckoning that I've watched happening in Ireland, which is so painful and so important. And there is a reckoning, as you know, happening in Canada as well around the colonial history of this land, and about there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We are now in a period of what I hopefully like to think of as Indigenous resurgence. We have a very particular history of colonization on this land, made particularly particular by the fact that there were two colonizers, England and France. And we now do land acknowledgements, as we heard at the beginning of this event. You have a particular history of colonization on that land. How is that playing out at the moment in theater in particular?
I think, I mean, obviously, yeah, so we were colonized, but I regularly, whenever we talk about the 800 years of oppression, I do try to remind everyone that we did not behave very well when we emigrated. So I think that the themes, like, you know, themes are the best way to kind of look at how it plays out, you know, like with the establishment of the National Theatre, like nationalism was, every play was about nationalism. And I think like now, you know, post-colonial, most of the themes are still about identity, but what it means to be Irish, or authority or freedom. I mean, I still think they're the prevalent themes. I think that yeah, we still like so many themes are still about the pain of exile, you know, land rights. Like I would say that I feel, except for our kind of younger artists and more emerging artists, where they're much more contemporary in their outlook, I would say that we are very text-based theatre. You know, it's still very traditional. Now that's a bit sweeping, actually, because we support a lot of amazingly new, innovative theatre artists here. But yeah, I think it's we still struggle with who we are and what we are, and what makes us, having fought for your freedom, say, and coming from a disputed territory, it's so nuanced. I think, like, looking at, say, the decade of centenaries, did you follow any of that?
Out of the corner of my eye?
Yeah, well, I think it was a real way where the government, everybody decided we were going to package, you know, from 2012 to 2022 to try to, because it's so complex when you try to talk about what you are, and like there's so many things that are still incredibly difficult to talk about, and there isn't agreement, and there's still, it's very quick, we can be very quick to get to conflict, so they packaged it beautifully. They decided they were going to cover everything, and did a very good job of us celebrating every aspect, even the least popular aspects of our history. So yeah, I think it's hugely difficult.
Without getting too much in the weeds about this, I was struck by something you said about ITI's remit, which I was also struck by when we were both at an event recently in New York, about a fantastic event that Culture Ireland held to allow Irish theatre artists to pitch their work at a kind of a trade show towards getting Irish work out and around the world. And Culture Ireland's remit is, both of your remits are island-wide. So you work with theatre artists in Northern Ireland as well?
Yeah.
Not getting too in the weeds, but is that always been your remit? Because I find that very striking. It's two different governments, it's two different funding systems.
Yeah, it's two different jurisdictions, and it can be problematic. I think that it's it has changed so often, Karen. It's very hard to know. Changes in policy, government policy, and public funding agencies' policies means that we can tour. If you are putting a tour together, you are encouraged to tour to Northern Ireland, but only a certain amount of money can be spent there. I mean, between the UK and Ireland, like English Arts Council now will allow for 15% of a touring grant to be spent outside and off the island of the UK, say. So I think for ITI is an all-island organisation. We would like to do more up north. It can be problematic crossing the border in relation to some of the sort of advice or sessions that we would give, but we are such a small country. We have to work in partnership. I mean, in the same way that like I reach out to colleagues in the UK as often as I can because we're neighbours. And I mean, we're a small island. If we don't get off the island, we become so insular. So yeah.
Speaking of that, but I will say, when I lived in Ireland for 5 years, I wrote about The Guardian, the British newspaper, about Irish theatre, and they defined it as all island. And I would take the train frequently to Belfast, which is 2 hours away, to see and review and write about theatre there. And that was a really interesting time around the time of the Good Friday Agreement. And I just was always struck, coming from the States, which is so vast, going, of course you should be talking to each other, and you should be thinking about cultural production across the island in holistic or at least relational terms. So I'm so glad to hear that's happening. Speaking of transporting Irish work abroad, I want to bring the end of our formal conversation to Toronto, in Canada, where it's a really exciting time for the presence and increasing profile of Irish arts and culture, because of the work of the Canada-Ireland Foundation to support Irish culture here, and the recent appointment of Renata Azevedo Moreira, who I believe is on this call, as the head of cultural affairs at the Consulate General of Ireland in Toronto. So to have a representative of the Irish government here to promote culture and cultural exchanges, I anticipate going to be transformational. I'm looking forward to seeing more Irish work come here. I'm looking forward to see Irish and Canadian artists working together. From your perspective at the ITI, why are things like that important? Like, what are the potentials in bringing Irish work, say, to Canada, or Irish and Canadian artists collaborating together?
I mean, together, yeah. So how we influence each other is only for the betterment of the form. And I mean, I regularly say I want Irish artists to play abroad. I want, international artists to play here. I mean, if you look at the development of the sector here, and it probably would have been, I don't know exactly when you left, but when like Lachlan Deegan and Willie White were directors of Dublin Theatre Festival, they would be one of the few organizations that could program international work. And you could see the younger generation's work alter depending on the spectacular work that was presented. And they would be one of the few opportunities that we would, and Galway International Festival as well, few opportunities that we as islanders are able to see the best of international work. But we also need to be making Canadian script or playwrights work. We need to be interpreting other cultures, or the best of plays, and looking at them through our own lens. Like an example would be, I don't know if this is the Abbey about a year and a half ago had a really amazing production of Brian Friel's translations. It was spectacular, probably the best production I'd seen. And I brought 2 Ukrainian friends, new friends, because we have now 100,000 Ukrainians in Ireland, and they were completely blown away and got quite emotional and talked for ages afterwards about the power of language and how language can be used in oppression. And
am I right, Niamh, was that the production that was Ukrainian?
No, they then, because it was so popular,
you're telling
they then brought over the Ukrainian company to do translations as well. So I just think how the power of theatre, the power of an amazing script and shared experiences, and how differently they can be viewed, and or similarly they can be viewed from different perspectives, or from somewhat similar but not completely similar perspectives. So yeah, we need to share, and we just need to be connected. We need to stay, we on an island definitely need to stay connected.
Yeah, I mean, I missed the I'm sorry I talked over you, but there was an amazing moment last year when a Ukrainian production of translations, which so resonates within the Ukrainian-Russian situation, what played in Ireland. And I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to be there to just hear that work resonate. in such an interesting way and in a time of terrible conflict. Cheryl, I see you popping on our screen, which I think means that we may have run out of time. Do we have time to maybe take one question, if that's okay? Because it's a great question from
It's a
Hanata.
wonderful, yes, please, let's do that, Karen.
Yeah. So Hanata, the very same, asked in the chat, Niamh, she loves the expression New Irish to refer to immigrants. Is that widespread? Can you talk more about it?
Yeah, so it's widespread in the arts for sure. And I do think socially, I think community groups and social activists we would all use that term. But again, we would be careful to use the term that the person wants us to use. And so while we're trying to engage new communities, we say New Irish. Go on, Karen.
Because it strikes me that you'd need to be very careful about that, right? Because now, I mean, certainly in my experience, working in the Young Critics program, which is with 16 to 18-year-olds, and I've been working on it for 21 years, that constituency is becoming increasingly diverse, ethnically diverse, diverse in terms of where their parents were born, maybe where they were born. And so at a certain point, New Irish aren't new anymore, they're Irish.
Absolutely, which is why you really need to check.
Yeah.
Never ever, ask. Yes, just never asking where you're from. I even found it the other day where I said it to an amazing artist who was in, and I went, "Where are you from?" And he went, "Ireland," and I went, "I know, where in Ireland?" You know, so like the sensitivity is because we haven't necessarily dealt with some key issues in relation to how diverse our society has become. I'm sure you all heard about the riots, recently enough. So yeah, I think we're all now campaigning the government to try to make sure that we engage in proper proper systems for dealing with the alt-right and making sure that we get it right now, because we're still in the early days and we can actually integrate, we can be completely diverse and flourish if we tackle it properly.
It's so exciting to be able to reconnect with you. So thank you for doing a kind of an amazing task of speaking both generally and specifically to some really interesting and complicated questions. So back over to you, to our hosts.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Niamh. Thank you both for a very warm and inspiring conversation this evening. On behalf of the Canada-Ireland Foundation, I want to thank you both. We owe you both a debt of gratitude for taking the time out of your busy schedules, and Niamh, for you staying up into the wee hours of the evening to spend some time with us tonight on this important celebration. Thank you also to the staff, to William and Beatrice, who brought this evening together. It takes a lot of coordinating, and again, we apologize for those technical glitches that we had earlier. Thanks also to our foundation chair, Robert Cairns, and the members of our board for your ongoing commitment to the celebration and commemoration of the story of Irish in Canada, and our mission to create public gathering spaces and to provide opportunities to artists for cultural exchange. On that topic, a very important initiative now underway under the direction and leadership of the board is the establishment of a new arts and culture centre on the Toronto waterfront, known as the Corlick. This 9,000 square foot building is currently undergoing an adaptive renovation from its former purpose as administrative offices for the Canada Malting Company. You saw images of that at the beginning of our session tonight. To a jewel box, which will house the Canada-Ireland Foundation and our exciting array of arts programming that we have planned for it. We look forward to welcoming you all there in 2025. And finally, before we let you go, we have a series of events planned for the coming year. Our next event will take place in March at the Rivoli, an evening with musician and singer-songwriter Danny Larkin. So please check out our website for details on that event. And we look forward to seeing you there and wish you all a very pleasant and safe evening ahead. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, Niamh. You can go now.